Sometimes cables make a difference. Sometimes, not so much. Sometimes it's the expensive cables that are great, sometimes not so much. I've used Supra cables in my systems for quite some time now, and mostly I've always liked them. When the local importer and distributor of Supra here in Australia and New Zealand reached out to tell me that there were some new Supra products available, I was interested to give them a go. What I received from him were 3 quite different cables. There's the new premium version of the Supra Sword interconnects that I've been using as a reference cable for quite some time now. There's also a new lower grade XLR cable called the Annorum interconnect. And then there's a new digital cable in the form of the Digital Excalibur XLR. I tried all 3 of those cables and the results were quite varied. The music was all streaming via a Volumio Revo Plus, and that was being powered by Volumia's own linear power supply. That review is one to watch out for, so subscribe if you're keen. The Revo Plus was then feeding into the Gishelli Labs Daisy DAC, and that was all done via the new Supra AES cable, the Digital Excalibur XLR, except for when I was doing the comparisons, and I'll tell you about that then. And from there, the various XLR interconnects that we're going to talk about today were running from the 2 pairs of XLR outputs on the Daisy DAC off to the live HP2A headphone amp and preamp. Now, I like to use headphones when I'm assessing interconnects because I feel like they give me a slightly better sense of all of the little details and fine nuances that are going on between cables, if there's any to be heard. But I have also used these various cables with speaker setups, and everything I'm about to say from my headphone listening does translate to the speakers as well. Let's kick off with the crown jewel here. The older Supra Sword XLR interconnects, which are still an ongoing line in Supra's range, retail for €490 for a 1 meter pair. That's near enough dollar for dollar, so let's call it $490. They also have a really annoying design on the connectors, where the left and right channel markers are just little black and red rubber O-rings. Those can really easily flick off the plugs, disappearing off, never to be found again, and it's why on my various Supra reference cables, I used a Sharpie pen to mark the channels. It's a really disappointing design. The RCA versions of the Supra Sword interconnects are far better because they've got red and white printing on the actual plugs. Moving now to the new Sword XLRs, these now cost €564 or $564 near enough. That's €74 more, $74 more for those not paying attention. For that money, you're getting rhodium plated connectors which are meant to be superior. What you're also getting are those same rubber O-rings for the channel markers. That's disappointing. Looking at the new Sword Rhodiums and handling them doesn't reveal any other differences between the new version and the old version, or the premium version and the now less premium version. Looking online on the Supra website, it also doesn't suggest that the differences go any further than the rhodium plating. To be clear, I'm not saying that there is nothing else different, it's just unclear if there's anything different. Once I connected both cables up and started listening, it was still just as difficult to work out if there's any differences. Honestly, I can't suggest that there are definitely audible differences between the 2 cables based on the system I was using for testing. It's possible that the new rhodium version might deliver a very slight increase in refinement and smoothness of the treble, but it could absolutely be my brain playing tricks on me. It's not as though I'm saying that I've heard what I expected to hear because I had no idea what to expect, but it's also still a small enough difference, if there is one, that it could just be auditory mind games. And so we're going to keep this part of this video very, very short. If you already have the standard Supra Sword interconnects, I can't really recommend upgrading to the rhodium version. If you're buying premium interconnects for the first time though, the rhodium version may provide a very slight increase in performance, that slight extra refinement in the treble, and so it all depends on whether you want to spend the extra for a very slight uptick in performance that may or may not be obvious on your system. Now, if you want to know more details about how the Supra Sword interconnects perform in general, I'm going to leave you to go and check out my dedicated review of the Supra interconnect range, because we've got some other cables to go and talk about now, and we're going to go down in price. When I originally reviewed the Supra Sword interconnects, I also reviewed this cheaper set called the EFF XLR cables. These retail for just €101 for a 1 meter pair, so they're much cheaper. I also really liked them and felt that some people would prefer their slightly fuller overall sound, especially on lower level audio systems where the maximum performance, the maximum resolution of the Supra Sword cables might not be realized. What Supra have done now is create a middle ground between these cheaper but still excellent EFF-I XLR cables and the Supra Sword level cables. And these are the Supra Annorum XLR cables. These cost €228, $230 odd for a 1 meter pair. Given that I already had the Supra Sword Rhodium cables in the system, I started off comparing these to those. The only problem with that test was that I forgot which cable was plugged into which input of the HP2A headphone amp and preamp. And so this became sort of a blind test. As I listened and made my notes, I found that input 1 from the HP2A was consistently more relaxed and easy to listen to. Input 2 was either a bit more detailed in the high frequencies or perhaps a little bit grainy. It was hard to tell because it depended on the exact track. More switching between these two inputs showed that whatever was connected to input 1 was pushing the vocals back a little bit from me, and in fact the whole soundstage was back a little bit further. And so the overall result from input 1 compared to input 2 was that input 1 was creating a greater sense of space. On the other hand, input 2 was creating a greater sense of intimacy. Prophets in the Sky has a piano playing chords in it, and from input 1 I was starting to hear more of the harmonic richness of the piano coming through the system. Everything was just sounding more right and more natural from whatever was connected to input 1. And remember, the DAC was the same, the stream was the same, it was just the XLR cables that were different. I should also stress that I'm not saying here that the differences were huge, but they were clearly perceptible. And with that clearly perceptible difference, I was consistently being drawn to input 1. Now, sadly, that means that we do need to spend more money for better sound because input 1 was the Supra Sword cables. And make it interchangeable, whether it's the Supra Sword Regular or the Supra Sword Rhodium, they're so close that that's going to be the same general difference between the Annorum cables and the Sword level cables. And so given that I'd really enjoyed the EFF-I XLR, that being the cheaper level cables again, compared to the Sword cables, I started to wonder if maybe the EFF-I XLR cables were better than the newer Annorum cables. No, sorry. The Annorum cables are clearly better than the EFF-I XLR cables. They deliver more soundstage space and layering of the sounds, and they just generally open the music up more than the EFF-I XLR cables. Listening with the Annorum XLRs creates a greater sense of space around each instrument. It has its own sense of space within the soundstage more, and then also the overall soundstage size is opened up as well. Or perhaps instead of saying it's opened up, I should say that the Annorums reveal more space. The cables aren't creating anything here. They're just doing less damage, for want of a better word, to the signal and allowing our ears and our brains to just take in more of the subtle, nuanced information that helps us to reconstruct the soundstage in our heads. And so I think the Annorums are an excellent cable. They're a clear step up from the EFF cables, which I already think are great value for money, and they fill a gap for those that maybe don't want to go as far as the Sword cables, but do want slightly better sound. And so if you're looking for analog interconnects for what I would consider sort of a mid-tier to upper mid-tier system where you don't want to invest that sort of money as the Sword cables demand, then the Annorums could be a really good choice. But we're not quite done, so let's wrap things up by talking about the new Supra AES cable, for want of a better word. They're calling it the Digital Excalibur XLR, but for our purposes, it's going to be used for AES connections. This is another case where Supra already had a cheaper cable that was already excellent. The DAC XLR cable is just €49 or 50 odd US for a 1 meter cable. The new Digital Excalibur XLR jumps up to $220 US for a 1 meter cable. And I know that many people argue that digital cables and even different types of digital inputs can't make a difference, but I'd suggest that they probably haven't heard these two cables through AES. Even though digital cables do not alter the data going through them, they must be influencing the noise or some other factor about the transmission of that signal, because the upgrade from the standard DAC XLR cable to the Digital Excalibur XLR cable is the biggest and most significant thing that I heard in all three of these tests. Swapping between these two cables while keeping everything else the same reveals a more open soundstage, better separation of sounds, and just generally a slightly easier listening experience when using the Digital Excalibur XLR. The sound is a bit smoother, It's a bit more enjoyable, but there's also a little bit more detail available as well. It's not smoothing things off so much as allowing the details to come through more easily. I know it might not make sense on the surface because this is a digital cable, but it's one that I'm going to recommend wholeheartedly because the differences are stark. If you have a system that can run AES, and you're currently running a lower level or generic style cable, or maybe you're currently running through optical, coaxial, or USB, I'd recommend giving AES a go with this cable. Now, one final point about Supra cables, in case you are keen to give these a go, is that their availability, their distribution, retailing, and even marketing is a little bit spotty. And so I'll try to find some links to put in the description down below. I've got no idea what I'll find, who I'll find, or any of that, but whatever I can find, I'll put in the description so you can go and check these out for yourself. And now if you've reached this point and you're wondering how cables can possibly make a difference to the sound of your system, I recently released a video that discusses all the science explaining that exact topic. So you can click this one up here and watch that next. For now, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and to those of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. And until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you again soon on Passion for Sound.